Hello, I'm Bob McEwen. Welcome to the Fifth Estate and our 30th season on CBC. Tonight, a spotlight on one of the world's most powerful people. Some say the most powerful, period. A man who chose himself for the job, who prefers to work behind the scenes, and who doesn't much care for people poking into his business. So that's exactly what we did. He's Dick Cheney, a major league power broker for 30 years, running for re-election as U.S. Vice President.
It's just impossible to overestimate Cheney's importance.
He quarterbacked the rush to war in Iraq, a war based on fictions about Saddam Hussein, like this one.
He is using his procurement system to acquire the equipment he needs in order to enrich uranium to build a nuclear weapon.
People have been taught to do things the Cheney way.
If you disagree with Dick Cheney, the highly predictable result is you will no longer be working for Dick Cheney.
And what can happen to those who cross him.
The idea was to tell other analysts that if you do to us what Wilson has done to us, we'll do to you what we've just done to Wilson's wife.
Tonight, a portrait of Vice President Dick Cheney, like none you've seen before. They took the world to war. Now, the U.S. election will not only be a referendum on the occupation of Iraq, but also on their personal vision of the future. A 21st century dominated by the United States.
I wish I could tell you it was about oil. I wish I could tell you it was about Israel. No, this is about an idea.
It is the very heart of American foreign policy. But incredibly, it's been largely driven not by the instincts of President George W. Bush, but of his running mate, the man some say is second in command, in name only.
It's just impossible to overestimate Cheney's importance.
Dick Cheney's world is a place where he controls the inner sanctum, doing and saying what he wants. About American power.
The government of the United States will not look the other way as threats accumulate against us.
About business.
We've not done any business in Iraq since the sanctions were imposed.
About war.
Time is not on our side, that if we wait, he will continue to develop ever more deadly capabilities.
But in Dick Cheney's world, what he says is frequently more fiction than fact.
Before 9/11, we tended to think in terms.
And what he does often seems to be motivated less by principle than power, self-interest, and money. And as we'll show you, his story tells a great deal about the world in which we live and how it got that way. Dick Cheney started out in Casper, Wyoming, an oil industry outpost where he grew up to be a high school football star. And Cheney had talent. Football captain, top 10 student, boyfriend of homecoming queen Lynn Vincent. According to Cheney, some of his earliest memories were of vehicles in the nearby oil fields. He didn't know it yet, but those distinctive red trucks belonged to a company that would play a big part in his life, Halliburton. What Cheney did know was that there was life beyond Casper. A family friend pulled some strings, and he got a scholarship to Yale.
It's hard to flunk it out of Yale. It's something that one really has to put an effort into. Yale, at that time, tried to make sure that everybody who entered graduated.
Jacob Plotkin was Cheney's Yale roommate. He recalls a homesick young man who preferred typing letters to his girlfriend to attending class.
Where others might spend some time on a weekend studying, Dick was either talking, drinking, playing cards with his football buddies.
In the end, Cheney flunked out of Yale twice.
As I often remind
George W. Bush, who squeaked through Yale himself with a C average, went out of his way to rub it in.
So now we know. If you graduate from Yale, you become president. If you drop out, you get to be vice president.
Back in Wyoming, there were other things on Cheney's mind. He took a job with the local power company. He got arrested for drunk driving. Even worse, he had lost his student draft deferment, just as the U.S. was becoming embroiled in Vietnam. The man who would eventually send Americans off to war wasn't enthusiastic about going to war himself. In 1963, with thousands of GIs already in Southeast Asia, Cheney went back to college and got another student deferment. In 1964, when Congress approved unlimited force in Vietnam, that student deferment was renewed, and he wed his high school sweetheart, Lynn. In 1965, when President Lyndon Johnson doubled the number of draftees, Cheney graduated. He should have been prime draft bait, but he wasn't, because he was now a married man. When the U.S. announced it would start drafting married men without children, call it good luck or good timing, but 9 months and 2 days later, the Cheney's first child was born. Cheney was rewarded with a 5th and final exemption from military service. At last, on his 26th birthday, he could relax. He was officially too old to be drafted. Now, instead of avoiding the U.S. government, he set out to join it. When Dick Cheney first arrived here in Washington from Wyoming, he went to work for a Republican congressman. Ironically, the first project for the man who'd engineered a series of draft deferments to keep himself out of Vietnam was writing a law to punish colleges for allowing anti-war protests. And Dick Cheney's career had only just begun. They were heady days for Republicans when Richard Nixon took back the presidency after 8 years of Democratic rule, and Cheney was determined to take advantage. He met with one of the young Turks of the new administration, Donald Rumsfeld, and he talked his way into a job. Eventually, the two of them would move to the White House together, Rumsfeld as Gerald Ford's chief of staff, Cheney as his deputy.
I found memos from Cheney about what salt shakers should be used at White House dinners, whether Betty Ford should have a headrest on the helicopter or not, who gets White House Christmas cards and who doesn't.
Journalist James Mann has covered Dick Cheney's journey through the corridors of power for more than 30 years.
Cheney is a guy who started at the bottom. He knows how the White House works right down at the grassroots level, and then he uses that to great effect.
Cheney's quiet rise continued nonstop. Youngest White House chief of staff, congressman for a decade, then Secretary of Defense under the first President George Bush. And here's where the story of Dick Cheney really starts to get interesting.
Tonight, the first pictures of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait.
It was almost a decade and a half ago when Iraqi troops took control of Kuwait. But what happened next is today eerily familiar.